Now this train I ride on is 100 coaches long. You can hear a whistle blow a million miles. 'Cause this train run me right, I'll be home Saturday night, though I'm 900 miles from my home. I still love to hear that lonesome whistle blow, that long, lonesome train whistling down.
What was America like before that long, lonesome whistle echoed from one end of the country to the other? How did people get around? How did they transport the things they grew to where they might sell and trade them for the things they needed? Well, in those days, the cheapest and easiest transportation was by water. Pioneers west of the Alleghenies, including a young fellow by the name of Abe Lincoln, used the current of the Mississippi River to float flatboats loaded with farm produce down to New Orleans. The trouble was, the river's current made it strictly a one-way road. Naturally, men began to make their own rivers. They called them canals. River roads that permitted traffic in both directions.
Although a canal is a two-way road, yes, a canal is a two-way road. It's slow in the summer and freeze in the cold. Oh, that's no way to move a payload. No, that's no way to move a payload. That's no way to move a payload.
Of course, all the roads in those days weren't water roads. There were roads on land, dirt roads called turnpikes.
Now a turnpike could make an east-west haul. Turnpike could make an east-west haul, but it was dusty all summer, muddy spring and fall.
A better way of building roads had to be developed. Roads made out of rails had been used in England in the coal mines. Since a horse could pull a much heavier load on a road of rails than on an ordinary dirt road, folks felt that roads of rails could be built for general use. But they still had to rely on the horse for power. Some men, however, were tinkering with the use of an entirely new kind of power for transportation. The fact that water, heated into steam, occupies 1,600 times as much space as it did in liquid form was destined to be the most important fact in the conquest of the American continent. It was the fact behind the steam engine. It meant the discovery of a source of power to do things that men had always done by hand. Way back in 1807, Robert Fulton proved that a steam engine could be made to turn paddle wheels to drive a boat on water. An Englishman named George Stephenson tackled the more difficult problem of harnessing steam power and making it propel a wagon on land. Stephenson set out to build a horse of iron, successful steam locomotive. The Iron Horse was born.
Oh, they brought it to America for the Camden and Amboy, the Mohawk and the Hudson line. And the Boston and Worcester, Baltimore and Susquehanna all had trains running mighty fine.
A miraculous thing had happened. People were able to hurtle through the American countryside at breakneck speeds, sometimes even exceeding 20 miles an hour. Of course, folks had to put up with a few inconveniences. Coaches were tied together with chains. When the locomotive started, the coaches were jerked into motion, and sometimes passengers were thrown off their seats. The first roads of rails, iron straps on wooden stringers supported by granite blocks, wore away quickly and often ripped loose. When this happened, the rails could be as deadly as a rattlesnake, and they were called snakeheads. Snakeheads continued to menace passengers until the railroad builders began to use wooden cross ties in a bed of yielding gravel to support the rails. But that only solved part of the problem. Robert L. Stevens, builder of the first railroad in New Jersey, went a good deal further. He designed a rail shaped like a T to be made entirely of iron. The T shape gave the best support for the amount of iron used, and it could also be spiked directly to the ties. His T-rail design is still used today. The locomotive, too, was changed to make it more suitable for American conditions. American railroads were built with many curves because of the ruggedness of the countryside. American mechanics removed the stationary front axle of the English locomotives. In its place, they substituted a front truck with 2 axles and 4 wheels, pivoted to the locomotive frame. This made it possible for the machine to take curves with less wear and tear on wheels and rails. Railroading in America quickly outdistanced the development of railroad transportation in the rest of the world. And this was no accident. Probably no other nation at any time in history so needed cheap, efficient overland transportation as the vast, rugged landmass of the United States in the 19th century. To the inland farmers, the railroads meant the possibility of shipping their surplus products directly to the east. To the farmer's wife, the railroads meant the possibility of buying and receiving the manufactured products of the city's factories. Farm life was transformed. The railroads provided a window to the world. Now that farmers could sell their surplus products, they gave up self-sufficient farming and raised crops and livestock for sale. The cities, too, were transformed by the power and the magic of the iron horse. As farmers bought more manufactured goods, more and bigger factories were built in the cities. City populations doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and the inexhaustible iron horse carried the food over long distances to feed the city folk. The very face of America was changed. The railroads pushed farther and farther west, opened new frontiers, spurring the settlement of what had been an almost uninhabited wasteland. But the iron trail of the iron horse was not always. The railroads were also freighted with disaster.
On a dark and stormy night, not a star was in sight, and the north wind came howling down the line. With his fireman right near, stood a brave engineer, a-bringing in that train right on time. Well, the wheels hummed a song as the train rolled along, and the black smoke came pouring from the stack, and the headlight a-gleam sent out a piercing beam as his train thundered down on the track. As he rounded the hill, his brave heart stood still. A warning light was shining in his face. There was a bridge around the bend, and he knew this was the end, for the old iron bridge had crumbled out of place.
A clue to the menace of the iron horse could be found in its name, iron. Iron was not strong enough to stand the strain of constant use, tremendous weight and power, and sustained high speeds. Iron rails wore out too rapidly. Iron bridges collapsed too often. Man already knew how to make steel, but in those days, steel could only be made in small batches by heating iron in a crucible for 2 weeks in order to drive out the carbon. But then in the 1850s, a remarkable new, fast, and inexpensive method of making steel was discovered. This was the Bessemer process, and it made it possible to produce tons and tons of steel in a few minutes. Steel for sturdier rails, steel for stronger bridges, steel for more powerful locomotives, and steel for heavier rolling stock. Soon, a great network of steel spanned the vast American continent. The fantastic dream of a railroad going all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific was realized. The last steel rails were fastened in place on May 10th, 1869, symbolizing the final conquest of the American continent. America was coming to maturity, riding on the railroad.
This train I ride on, she goes from coast to coast. You can hear a whistle blow a million miles. 'Cause this train runs me right, I'll be home Saturday night. Though I'm many, many miles from my home, I still love to hear that lonesome whistle blow. That long, lonesome train whistling down